We're still here at the sidelines of the WTO Public Forum here at Geneva, talking to some of the important people about issues of trade. My name is Bernard Avle, and we are privileged to have been joined by the Deputy Executive Director of the ITC, the International Trade Center, in the person of Ms. Dorothy Tembo, to talk to us about the work of the ITC and how she finds the public forum. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So how are you finding the forum so far?
Amazing as always. Amazing, I think, from different perspectives. First, I think this is the first time post-COVID that we're really having the opportunity to have everybody in place to interact and try to, as usual, have the dialogue, but exchange views, but also importantly, be able to use this opportunity to illustrate in very concrete ways by showcasing some of the results and showcasing some of the good practices that are happening on the ground. So for me, absolutely delightful to be able to be back here, to be having the type of conversations that we have.
From what we know about the ITC, you're very interested in capacity building and supporting small businesses. So why is the WTO an important platform for you?
First and foremost, we are part of the WTO in some ways because, as you may know, we are jointly funded by the World Trade Organization and the United Nations. So by default, I think we are very much part of the WTO. But what's even more important is what we do in relation to our operations and our mandate, per se, which is one that is very much focused on translating the agreements and the policies that are discussed within the two parent organizations into very operational ways, working directly with private sector, because at the end of it, we put the policies in place to enable private sector to do business, and that's what we are really about at the core of our mandate, making sure trade happens, supporting micro, small and medium enterprises.
When I sit in the sessions and listen to discussions on trade, the impression is created that these are large companies. We're talking about big business with high volumes of trade. How important are small businesses in the scheme of things that the WTO discusses generally?
You make a very great observation, which is why I think we should be central. We should be central. A lot of assumptions are made. Yes, indeed. I think one has to look at the evolution of the work that the WTO has been doing. I think we are coming from the Uruguay round and then transitioning into the WTO in 1994. And at the time, I think the focus was very much on established businesses that could actually be able to export. But times have changed. I think at the time the information was so scanty, which is why a part of what we do really focuses on ensuring that we are able to provide information that will enable people to better understand the context. But if you're specifically looking at many of the countries in terms of the analysis that has been done to this point, it's the micro, the small and medium enterprises that are the backbone of many of the economies. For Africa in particular, 90% of the businesses are really micro, small and medium enterprises. So this is, over the years, is what has led all of us to start reflecting and rethinking how can we better reposition a very significant part of business that is perhaps excluded because of the very nature of how the rules and agreements were defined, which were essentially perhaps at the time focusing more on very well established businesses.
So the ITC comes to solve that problem operationally. So what does that mean? Is it to mean then that once the agreements are reached, the support for SMEs in terms of capacity building is what you do? Or just give me a sense of the ITC's operational role when it comes to WTO.
Yeah. There are many elements that we do. Of course, it's about ensuring that the information is put out there. So a lot of what we do revolves around what we commonly refer to as public goods, but essentially these are tools that will analyze the context and be able to give the necessary information that businesses will need, both in relation to understanding what the state of play is, but also in relation to the markets that they're exporting. I mean, the core of what we do is, of course, we're working with businesses, but it's to make sure at the end of the day that they really can be competitive and be able to actually access markets. And at the end of this all is really that developmental dimension. So making sure that the income is coming in a consistent way that improves the lives of the people that we are working with. So we have the layer of information, but we also have the layer that addresses itself to creating an enabling environment that involves us working with policymakers, but from a private sector perspective. So any policies that can affect businesses, we will work with the beneficiary countries as well as the other stakeholders that we have to make sure that we are creating or facilitating, putting in place the right policies that will support business. Third dimension is that we work directly with private sector, ensuring that we are enhancing their skills, we are enhancing the operative side of the businesses so that they can be able to produce in a very sustainable way. And I absolutely like the conversations that we've had the last week, because that sustainability component is one that we really need to enforce, particularly coming out of a post-COVID scenario, a scenario where we have climate change seriously threatening us, a situation where we have cost of living, increases, and of course we have one aspect that we really do not desire to see going up, which is the conflict side. But unfortunately that is the case, particularly for your and my continent. This is something which is unfortunately seemingly creeping in a way that is going to affect the continent's progression. So the sustainability side of it is something that we have to entrench, and here we're working with a number of companies to adapt themselves to make sure that they are able to still remain relevant and able to do business in the new context. But finally, there's a critical part of our work which I think sometimes is not so much spoken to by many people. It's one thing for ITC or any of the other partners to go in and work with the countries on a specific intervention. But if we don't put in place the necessary measures that will enable the sustainability of that intervention from an institutional perspective, it comes to zero once we move out. So part of our approach is one that works with business support organizations, which can be chambers, which can be cooperatives, or which can be any other business-related entities that provide a service to businesses. So we will work with them not only to make them understand, but also to make sure that the quality of service they are providing is one that would be able to service those that are in need of it, and one that would be able to adjust with the times to be able to respond in an effective way.
So that's a four-pronged: information, policy, support, sustainable business environment, and then actually implementing these policies with the business support organizations. Brilliant. So what can you report in terms of your work? Now we are here in Geneva, September 2023. So if you look maybe the past 12 months, one or two big things the ITC has done in Africa that you are so proud of?
Very proud that we are part of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and there we've provided work from the negotiations into the assessments, into the development of the strategies that some of the countries are actually using now, but also from a country perspective, working on specific interventions that have been identified, that have the opportunity to actually provide businesses that possibility of exporting. I think when the conversations on the African Continental Free Trade Area started, a lot of questions were being raised by some parts of Africa itself, but even beyond, and the possibilities of making sure that this gets operational were ones that were not so certain. But I think with partners not only not only ITC, but others as well, I think providing that support, getting to the ratification process and getting into the implementation is really something that we all should be proud of. Does this mean that we are at our optimal place in terms of realizing the opportunities of the AFCFTA? Not at all. There's still a lot of work ahead of us that needs to be addressed. Perhaps one example would be coming back to Ghana. First and foremost, we had the WTPO, which you referred to, which was a big event for us, which again provides a platform that brings together the different business support organizations to share views, but also use that opportunity for us to get a key as to where the priority elements are, and that we focus our capacity building support in those areas. But beyond that, I think more on the practical side is the work that we're doing with the cocoa farmers. We are working with cocoa farmers in Ghana, and over the years we have been able to produce some of the chocolate, I think, which you have seen.
I was handed over one bar which I know of already. So this was made by a smaller chocolatier. This is not from a large company.
But that's precisely the point.
Yeah.
The point is we are trying to be inclusive in our approach. I think in the past you talked about big companies. What you're looking for is how are we going to connect micro, small and medium enterprises across the board, particularly those that are most vulnerable, but also those that have traditionally been excluded from the value chains because of distance, because of many other things. And this is really what we are trying to do. If we are talking about the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, really we have to be very practical and very intentional in terms of making sure that we are being inclusive. We are in many aspects also addressing issues related to women empowerment, issues to youth being included when you take into account, the numbers that we have on the continent in relation to the youth. So it's intentional on our part that we are also reaching the very small ones and trying to facilitate them.
Okay.
I think in many ways, many of the solutions that have been provided are for those businesses that might be export ready. But what we are saying is, let's adjust, let's customize to provide solutions that are workable for the small ones.
So these are our trade conversations. We're here at the WTO Public Forum in Geneva, Switzerland, and my guest for this segment is the Deputy Executive Director of the International Trade Center, the ITC, in the person of Ms. Dorothy Tembo. While I appreciate the work you do for SMEs, there's a school of thought that when it comes to increasing particularly Africa's role in global trade, we need aggregation. So if you have small companies producing this, it's fine. But if they would be getting regular supply to the shelves in Europe or to North America, they need to raise their standards. So if they can't scale up as small companies, they need to aggregate with other SMEs so they can take advantage of things like AGOA. What's your thinking around that? How do we move away from simply having nice stories on SMEs doing beautiful things like this to now becoming more significant players in the markets and on the shelves of lucrative countries?
No, I think you raise again a very important and valid point. And yesterday we had a panel about transitioning to the green economy and the AFCFTA being a potential opportunity to do this. And here I think is where we really have to think beyond the boundaries, the national boundaries. And the Continental Free Trade Area, in my view, is really a good opportunity. But that, we shouldn't forget, builds on earlier regional integration entities. So there are some building blocks there that the Continental Free Trade Area can try to use to take things forward. And a lot of what we discussed yesterday was around making sure that we are more strategic in identifying first and foremost where the opportunity lies. So in this particular instance, as an entity, we have been supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area, in particular the African Union Commission, working with them to define where these opportunities lie. And 94 sectors were initially selected, but out of those we moved ahead with 4 because we were just in the middle of COVID, and so there was urgency, for instance, to look at the pharmaceutical side. And we did the analysis. We have provided a clear guidance of what is potentially possible, how countries can work across borders to actually not only consolidate, but to also add value to be able to then export. I think when you look at the intra-African figures, they're very low. Very low because one, we all produce the same things. Secondly, that there's minimal value being added. And that is what we have to really address ourselves to if we really, the continent has to be transformational. And this is where most of the partners, including ourselves, we are coming in to say, let's work together, collaborate, leverage the resources that are there so that we can have a much higher impact, focused mainly on ensuring that the industrialization does happen, the diversification does happen, and indeed the value addition along that.
So Ghana released a trade vulnerability report last month for last year. Our top 3 exports: cocoa, gold, oil, mostly exported raw to, incidentally, gold is exported to this country, Switzerland, cocoa to Europe, North America, and then of course China for our oil. The closest African country on that list that got our exports was Burkina Faso, which is a neighboring country. So when you look at the traditional sector, the lines are still as established by the colonialists. But when we looked at the Ghana Export Promotion Authority's NTE report, then we realized that 36% of our exports are to other African countries. So it appears there's promise, as you hinted, for continental trade among the non-traditional sector for a country which is resource intensive like Ghana. Are there any specific product lines that make you hopeful, or that you think countries like Ghana, Zambia, Nigeria should consider in developing what is called non-traditional exports in that sense?
One of the sectors that has been actively discussed with us by many of the countries is the interest that is being generated in the motor vehicle industry. A very complex sector, I must say, and I think we have to look at it critically, and I know that the African Afri-Exim is actually providing a lot of support in this area. If I'm not wrong, I think it's about $2 billion that has been pledged. This is one area where I think governments can collaborate. Governments, but in particular businesses, I think is what we should be talking about. They can collaborate, but facilitated from all angles to make sure that the enabling environment is really there. It's the electric batteries, which is also very complex, but it's also the other parts that are part of this value chain or supply chain that could be a possibility. I still believe that in relation to minerals, Ghana, like my own country, are very much dependent on the mineral sector. But it's the mineral sector, it's the minerals being exported in their raw form. So it's the copper ores in our case. I think trying to see how that can move in a direction where there's more value add is really certainly the way we could go. I do recall when I was at the Ministry of Trade in Zambia that we had an instance where we had the copper mines on the copper belt, which is very close to the Democratic Republic, and they were producing the same copper. But we were actually transporting a portion of that production into the Congo just for some minimal processing, then it comes back because then the origin of the export had to be Zambia. But there are many things I think that can be done. Cotton to textiles, I think, is also another area that was identified as a priority sector where countries can collaborate. A lot is happening. I mean, as you can see, very much wearing Ghanaian products, but I'm sure the fabric may have been from Ghana, but may have been from elsewhere. We import all these things when they can be sourced within the region. So the opportunity is very much there.
But having said that, how frustrating is it that up till now the Africa Group keeps talking about the cotton fall and some of the unresolved issues they have? We've spoken about agribusiness as well, where there are major issues in things like domestic support, stock holding. Again, the Africa Group is not happy. They are looking at MC13 and expecting some work on there as well. Even with ICT, there's a whole conversation around the TRIPS agreement and how it affects technology transfer in a way that can let us go green. So whilst we appreciate what you're doing, there appear to be larger bottlenecks within the WTO in negotiating some of the big agreements, which really stymie the progress of developing countries. What's your message to the African continent? Is the WTO still the place to be for the resolution of these matters? Do we need a new strategy?
Absolutely. I think nothing can be better than the multilateral process. What does it give you? Predictability. You know, let me give a specific example, being somebody who has come from the LDC, an LDC country. In 2005, when we were moving towards the Hong Kong ministerial, one of the aspects that LDCs were asking was for duty-free, quota-free market access. And the reason that was being asked was that even though many of these countries had bilateral or multilateral arrangements, for Africa in particular, I think at the time we had the Cotonou Agreement, all this was non-reciprocal. When you have a non-reciprocal agreement, the predictability of continuity of that agreement is one that could potentially come into question depending on what conditions are around the agreement or what conditions develop in the countries that are extending this. Bringing this into the multilateral sphere was one that was very much focused on ensuring that you have predictability, because if you make that commitment, that is a commitment that is lasting. So for me, the multilateral process is not one that is questionable, it's one that is still valid. It is also understandable, I think, in some ways that there are questions arising because of different pressures that are coming through, but it's also that times have evolved and perhaps there needs to be some conversations that are being had, which is where you see elements that are coming in which also are very positive, which we have been involved in from our perspective. One, it's the conversations that are going on in an informal way, very specific to micro, small, and medium enterprises. What this process has been doing, even though it's informal and it's not enshrined within the agreement, not only has it raised the awareness around making sure that small businesses actually need perhaps to be looked, elements need to be looked into at a much more closely and perhaps applied, whether it's at the multilateral level or the regional level or indeed at the national level. Secondly, it's that within this discussion you certainly see a progression towards perhaps ultimately having an integration of these elements. But you also have to acknowledge that some of the countries perhaps do not have the equal level of, I don't want to call it authority, I'm trying to find the right word to describe that. You know, I may be small, I may have a real issue. But my voice is not being heard outside. So the multilateral process, I think, gives that opportunity for the groups like the African groups to consolidate their issues and be able to present them within a broader constituency that would be able to take into account some of those concerns. So for me, this is it. It has to remain as such. Should there be flexibility in terms of trying to take into account the differences in the level of development? I think this is something that has been spoken to. How much of this flexibility is taken on board is what the members have to continue discussing. Should there be flexibility to take into account the new context? That flexibility should be there. But how you integrate this into agreements that have been agreed to over time sometimes takes a bit of a while. But the relevance doesn't go on.
Final thought. How optimistic are you about the MC13, and also where do you see the ITC in the future of facilitating trade? What makes you hopeful, or what makes you anxious when you look into the crystal ball?
When I look into the crystal ball, I still would like to remain optimistic. Together with the rest of the ITC team, we can see what's happening on the ground. Some positive results have been attained, and I think we can build on those results. One does not dispute the relevance of trade. It is vital, particularly post-COVID and post all that I described earlier on. We have to make sure that we are, consolidating our efforts of support. So I think going towards MC13, I know there are complex issues that are being discussed, and these would obviously demand that the members continue to engage to better understand, and from our perspective, where we can, we will continue to provide the necessary information that will help understand situations even better. We are particularly focusing also on doing more in terms of increasing, the proportion of women's inclusion in the multilateral trading system. And here we are working jointly with the WTO, where we will be discussing this matter, and indeed we are looking towards ensuring that there is some additional funding facility that is provided to make sure that women can actually be able to have the access to the resources, because this is one of the key issues, not only for women, but more so for all the small businesses. So there are elements, I think, that we can continue to push, which would be feasible and viable and really concrete in terms of the results. But one fully understands the complexities of the issues that are being discussed within the broader discussions of that.
Thank you, Ms. Tembo. We were speaking to Dorothy Tembo, who's the DED of the ITC, and on a very heartwarming Ghana note, apart from the fact that what she's wearing was made in Ghana, this chocolate as well came from Ghana, and it was on display at their stand here at Geneva, as well as exhibiting some work they did with the NTFV, which really is a group of Ghanaian business process outsourcing ICT companies who are being supported. So a lot of good Ghana stories. Maybe we'll taste the chocolate on the show just to be sure that it's from Ghana. And we'll say a big thank you to you for coming on the program. Maybe you want to help yourself. I don't know. So this is chocolate from a Ghanaian company exhibited here in Geneva as part of the work ITC does to showcase the improvements we've seen in small business. Bon appetit.